This is Wild Nevadacast. I'm Dave Santina. You know that music from the Wild Nevada series on PBS Reno. Today I have Jack Hursh with me here, who ought to be familiar to everybody who's watched Wild Nevada on PBS Reno because of the episodes that Jack has appeared in. Jack's been in a couple. We did a trip to Peavine Peak most recently, but before that, you took us out to Winnemucca Lake, and you took us up to McLane Peak, which was a special day, and that's what I'm interested in getting into today because you helped name that peak, and I find that fascinating.
Yes, I did, David.
Yeah. How do you name a mountain?
Well, there's a long process involved with that, and beginning every state, almost every state, has a board, and we call ours the Nevada State Board on Geographic Names. So all states have a board of directors, and they are represented by all facets of their state governments. And there are always issues involved with geographic features in their states. Now, Nevada in particular, because of our size and because of the drama of our geology and landscape, we have many naming issues. We have tall peaks, we have low valleys, we have dry lake beds, we have canyons, we have ridges, and most importantly, we have many, many peaks. In fact, Nevada is considered the most mountainous state in the lower 48, according to how you cut the statistics, you might say.
Okay.
We actually have more peaks over 10,000 feet than any other state than Alaska. And we also have an incredibly large state. So naming issues come up all the time. So the Nevada State Board on Geographic Names is a very busy board.
Yeah, I bet. You know I learned that fact about Nevada being the most mountainous state from? Alvin McLane.
Alvin McLane. And yes, that brings us to that episode about McLane Peak. And McLane Peak was an idea that was generated by Charlotte Stock of the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology. And I also worked at the Nevada Bureau of Mines and Geology for 24 years. I was a cartographic technician, so I was involved with technical editing of documents about mining and geology all those years, and including maps on Nevada. But early on in my career at the Bureau, I was nominated to be a member of the Nevada State Board on Geographic Names. And that was, I was the representative for the University of Nevada on that board. Okay. So there are board members from different facets of the state governments, like Nevada Division of Wildlife and BLM and Nevada State Archives, the Nevada Historical Society, and on and on. So I was the representative for the University of Nevada. So Charlotte just happened to pass the suggestion to me one day, why don't we name a peak after Alvin McLane?
Okay, Alvin McLane, by the way, for those who maybe haven't seen Wild Nevada for 20 years back in the old days, he took us on more trips to more places than anybody in the history of that show, and he seemed to know every inch of this state, and he knew all the names of the peaks, and he would tell us about, what mountain range we were passing or what peak we were passing, and it never occurred to me where the names came from, but sounds like this is the process that most of them go through.
Absolutely. So just like Charlotte's suggestion, I ran with it, and the process involved, because I was already on the board, I just authored the proposal, and what happens, it gets put on a state agenda, the agenda of the state board on geographic names, and then every 4 months the board meets. And so there is a first hearing and a second hearing and then a final approval. And then that proposal gets passed on to the U.S. Board of Geographic Names in Washington, D.C. Now, there are certain criteria that are involved with naming something. You can't just name something after anybody. First of all, a person has to have been deceased for at least 5 years.
Really?
That's right.
Oh,
yeah. And
no
Alvin passed away in 2006, and this was approximately 2015 when we were deliberating over this naming.
Okay.
Another thing is that that person has to have contributed a great deal to the either philanthropy or the education or the benefit of that state. So we don't name something after somebody from another state, we want to name things from somebody that has contributed a lot to the state of Nevada. And of course, like Dave already suggested, Alvin McLane was extremely involved in Nevada. He lived here for over 50 years. Alvin was like the example of boots on the ground expertise. And Alvin was, you could call him a geologist, an archaeologist, a scientist, an explorer, an educator, you name it. And Alvin actually didn't even go to college. His expertise was so contributed by his just boots on the ground and going out in the field and hiking around and learning about Nevada.
It was incredible, the places he would take us, and from memory, things he had seen 30 years earlier, and he just remembered it and said, "Oh, this is great. You got to come and see this." And he would make a plan for us to go and travel with him. Incredible. So, how do you find a peak to name after a person? Do you have? I assume you got to find peaks that don't already have names, and then where do you go from there?
Well, the process, I got very involved with that process, knowing Alvin. I knew Alvin. I had bumped into him many times throughout the years and had long conversations with him. And Alvin, to name a few things, was the foremost expert in the state of Nevada on petroglyphs. In fact, he won a national award from the Bureau of Land Management on being an expert in the petroglyph and the conservation of petroglyphs. He was foremost expert on arches. He was foremost expert on caves and rock shelters in the state of Nevada. He actually was the founder of the Nevada Grotto of the Speleological Society. So those are folks that are into rock shelters and caves.
Bonus points for saying that one time through.
I think I got it right. And so Alvin, he was an expert on hoodoos, which are rock formations. And so I had conversations with Alvin, and I particularly knew that he was fond of very many areas of the state of Nevada, but I had long conversations with him about the Winnemucca Lake area, which is a dry now lake bed on the way to Gerlach, if you're ever driving Gerlach. And there's a very tall mountain range called the Nightingale Mountains on the east side of Winnemucca Lake. And I had also considered areas that had rock formations, hoodoos, arches, and also petroglyphs. And we decided that we found out that the Geographic Names does not name things after petroglyph sites, and that's just a technicality. And so we pushed that aside. And then the arches that were considered were really not that particularly spectacular, so we moved on. And so I actually, on my own, went out on my own little adventure and drove all the way up the east side, which is a very rough road, of Winnemucca Lake, and lots of washouts. I wouldn't recommend it to everybody. And
I wouldn't have done it.
Sure,
I certainly wouldn't have done it without you.
Either don't do it, period, or have a backup vehicle and lots of food and water and that type of thing. And so, and an emergency plan. So I did it anyway and explored the Nightingale Mountains. And sure enough, on the north end of the Nightingale Mountains was this very tall, very prominent, very precipitous, rocky peak. And I thought, aha, and it was unnamed. It was not named. And so then I got a hold of Alvin's brother, Don, and I talked to him about that peak, and Don gave full approval because he knew, and Don also had been with Alvin in that area doing archaeological surveys in that area. And Don gave full approval. He thought that was completely appropriate for that peak to be named McLane Peak. And Don actually joked, "Hey, it applies to me too."
Right? Yeah,
because he's a McLane also.
I would be able to. I would do the same thing. It's like, hey, you know what?
Yeah,
I'm going to tell people it's me.
Yeah. So I actually I took photographs of that peak, and I actually climbed that peak with some friends. And we took a lot of photos, and then I brought those photos back to the Nevada State Board on Geographic Names.
I remember this. If I remember correctly, these photos you're describing are the photos you showed me when you first approached us to perhaps go and climb that peak and visit it, because you knew how important Alvin had been to the Wild Nevada series, and you had been a person who had watched that show and said, hey, I got to tell you that there's a mountain peak named after Alvin McLane. And I remember at the time, we were not in production of the show, but we had been talking about resurrecting it essentially. We had between 2005 and 2017, we did only a 1 hour special in 2014 and nothing in between. It was all repeats. But I remember thinking, if we start this again, I already know one show. It's got to be McLane Peak, because we really love that guy, and we would, we kind of in tribute, we have to climb to the peak. And you showed me these photos that you took, and you were a fair distance from the peak, and there was a friend out standing on it and very small, waving at the camera.
Yes.
And that was, at the time, that was as far as you could go, right?
Oh, yeah. Well, this peak is very tall, very precipitous, meaning very large rocks that abruptly jut out. And when you're on those rocks, there are thousands of feet dropping very dramatically below you. And I have this little problem when I get into a situation like that called vertigo. So I was hiking with a friend and certainly had no realization about how quickly vertigo can hit you. Mm-hmm. And we had arrived at sort of a sub-peak. And when we got up to the top of that peak and I looked over the edge, my world just started to spin. And so I said, I can't go any further. I had to cling to the rock. And Cheryl had no problem. She's like, oh, I can go over there. And I said, oh, well, this is perfect. I took advantage of the situation. I said, if you go over to the actual tallest part of the peak and you get up there, I'm going to take pictures of you. And so sure enough, she got over there and did the victory with the raised arms. and we got those photos. So that is the photo that I shared with you.
I remember that moment when we had climbed to that spot and you stopped us and said, this is the place where I took the photos that I originally shared with you to try to sell you on the idea of coming here. And this is as far as I was able to go that day. Yeah. But today I'm going. You were determined to make it this time to the peak.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I was the guide for Wild Nevada, and right. I'm a big Wild Nevada fan, and by golly, I was not going to let anybody down on that trip. And so on that trip with the Wild Nevada crew, I was able to scale the entire peak. And
you did it, yeah.
Yeah. And what's fun, when I was experiencing vertigo on sort of that sub-peak and got that photograph, that sub-peak was crawling with ladybugs. And I had not experienced this before. I mean, swarming, absolutely swarming with ladybugs. And I learned later that ladybugs have a habit of, in springtime, going and scaling up a mountain and convening on a peak. And I guess it's part of their breeding season or
really?
Some kind of social event for ladybugs.
The ladybug equivalent of swimming upstream,
I think
of a
so.
salmon swimming upstream, but maybe they don't kick the bucket at the end of that.
I don't think they. Yeah, I'm not sure, but
I hope so.
Yeah,
that sounds like a beautiful thing to witness.
Yeah, it was pretty spectacular, actually.
How fun! So. I diverged here. We were talking about how the official naming
right.
of the peak.
Yeah. Okay. So sometimes proposals for different things can encounter controversy. That always happens. Sometimes there's political controversy. Maybe the naming just ends up after deliberation to be deemed not as appropriate as it should be. And thankfully, through our process with the Nevada State Board and the U.S. Board on Geographic Names, there was absolutely no opposition. Everybody had learned by then or already knew about the work of Alvin McLane. And so it was just a unanimous, swift process, you might say. First hearing was a unanimous approval. Second hearing was a unanimous approval. It got passed on to the U.S. Board. It was a unanimous approval. So that name became official in 2016, and that peak was named McLane Peak.
So happy that happened and that you brought it to us. We had not known each other at all.
Right.
You just contacted us out of the blue and said, hey, I watched the show. I love the show. I know you knew Alvin. I thought you might be interested in this. And it was, like a red flag for like, hey, pay attention to this. This is really special. And so being able to go and actually climb to the top of that peak, that was a moment for us. That felt special to be up there and sort of standing in a place that had an incredible view of Winnemucca Lake. Still does, I'm sure.
Oh yeah, it's still there.
But we got there. There was a register up there, and we were able to write our names in there and acknowledge that we were up there. And if I remember right, we left some Wild Nevada swag up there.
Yeah, we did.
I think we left a couple of. Oh, we left a thumb drive that had episodes on it, and put it in a Ziploc and put it in the container, and thought anybody wants to come and find it, they can say they were the first to come and find this after we did.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it happened. If you're out there listening to this by any chance or watching it on YouTube and you found that thumb drive with those episodes, let me know, because I think that would be cool to find out. I'm probably not going back up there anytime soon. So,
well, it is a word of warning. It is a very precipitous peak. It is not a peak that just the average person is going to go. It's in an extremely remote area. It's hard to get to, and you have to be in good shape, and it's very rocky. It's somewhat dangerous. And in fact, I had gone and hiked it and climbed to the top after our Wild Nevada episode with a couple of friends, and we were hiking and scaling at the end of the very ascent to the peak, and one of the hikers stepped on a rock, and that rock slipped out. Ooh. And it was essentially a big boulder, and that boulder suddenly went cascading down the cliffs and canyon.
Oh no!
And thank God nobody was below them.
Yeah.
And so this is a seriously remote and somewhat dangerous peak to climb, and just that word of warning.
That's good to hear. I'm glad you went back, and I'm glad that did not happen while we were there. No boulders cascaded. What I remember about that day, sometimes weird things stick in your memory, but one thing I remember about that day was our audio guy, his name was Dustin. I don't think he was prepared for that kind of a climb that day. He was wearing deck shoes. Oh. He spent the day in deck shoes, and at the end of the day, when we were trying to go up this rock and down a steep decline followed by a steep incline to the peak, he had some moments when he was looking around for something to grab onto, and I was nervous for him because he was not wearing the shoes that would be best suited for being out in that area. And I'm the last person to tell the world about what to wear and how to prepare, because I am not Mr. Outdoorsy, but that was crazy to me. And he realized he had made a great mistake at that point in the day.
Well, Dave can attest, sitting right across from me right now, I don't even arrive at KNPB without my hiking boots on.
That's true. Jack, you showed up today, and I thought, are you going out with Chris on a shoot to do a segment?
I'm ready.
You are dressed for a hike right now.
But going back to the McLane Peak episode and Dustin, you remember the very large rattlesnake we encountered?
Yes, that's right. And what was funny about that, everybody jumped out of the car to get video of the rattlesnake, except I got out last and got video of everybody getting video of the rattlesnake. I stayed farther back. I consider that to be self-preservation instinct, but it was really fascinating to see. And that whole trip was impressive. I mean, that was that's the kind of trip that I appreciate having been able to go on, because I would never go there on my own. I wouldn't take those driving in the washes. I wouldn't go up to that spot. I wouldn't even think to go up to that spot. And before we hit the peak, we stopped at a rock shelter, and I don't know if I ever told you this, but I got in a little trouble because of that rock shelter.
No way.
Yeah, I got an email a little while after that show premiered from the BLM saying, "Hey man, why'd you show people how to get to that rock shelter? That's a place, we don't like people going to places like that." And I said back to them, "Did you really think that we showed people how to get there?
We did not.
We showed about 3 seconds of the car driving, and then another shot of the car driving through a wash. There was no way anyone viewing that show could immediately know how to get there, but they, being the BLM and being concerned about the archaeological integrity of the space, it had already been excavated, obviously. they felt it necessary to say, don't show people how to get to these places, which we don't anyway.
Well, we did. We very purposely were very vague.
Right.
And then it's also another word of warning and a plea is to, when you have natural resources like that, you leave them alone. And so anybody listening, please respect all of your natural and historical resources.
Right. And we try to repeat those notions during these shows, but it's important to repeat them sometimes, just over and over again, because you can't say it enough. You can't say it enough. So now you get to see the words McLane Peak on maps. On does it show up on like a Google Earth?
Yeah. So the USGS, which is the United States Geological Survey, it holds a database called the Geographic Names Information System. So this is a huge database. Anybody can access it. It's the GNIS, Geographic Names Information System, to repeat it, and it's on the USGS website. And that, as soon as that is approved, that name goes on that database, and it becomes the official name for that location. And so that is the officiality of it.
I love it.
Yeah.
That has got to feel so gratifying when you see that.
Alvin and McLane Peak is perhaps the most gratifying. We named a lot of things in my tenure on that board. I was on that board for about 15 years and was executive secretary for several years, and then was the chair for a couple of years. And Alvin, I was so happy to have that peak named McLane Peak.
Well, I'm so glad that you did it. I'm so glad you brought it to us, because I honestly would never know.
Yeah,
except for Jack Hursh calling us and saying, "Hey, thought you might be interested in this. You knew this guy, Alvin McLane. How about this?
Did.
We're going to name this. We're naming this mountain after him." And I was fired up. I have never thought as quickly as I thought that day. Oh, well, I have to climb that mountain.
There you go.
Out of tribute.
Yeah,
that's what it felt like immediately, and that's probably the first time I ever thought that quickly. I have to climb that mountain for any mountain.
Well, one of the neatest parts of that episode too is at the very end when we're all sitting there on top of the peak and we just started reflecting, and that was a very good moment.
It felt it felt like maybe we had a little Alvin with us. At that point, we kind of felt the spirit. It was a really fun, and it was late in the day, so the sun was about to set, and we were all exhausted, and so there's anytime you bag a peak, you feel a sense of accomplishment, right?
Yeah. That
one felt even more special because of the story behind it. So I appreciate you bringing that story to us. While I've got you, I think I wanted to mention to people who like the Wild Nevada series and who watch that show that once in a while, things don't turn out the way we plan. Jack also appeared on a show we did at Peavine Peak, and the intent, Jack printed this big map that he brought to me from 1867 explaining the Peavine copper mines layout, and I think it was the first usage of the word Peavine in print. If I remember, you were introducing the name to us, and we were going to go out and walk the foothills there and talk about this mining district. You were going to show us some rock formations that were particularly interesting, and then we were going to walk around and look at this area that was now tailings from mining, but talk about the history of mining, which was fascinating. And as is often the case when we make plans, the plans decide not to cooperate. So we're climbing up this hill. We see a little walking stick, a bug, and we stop and look at the walking stick, and we think, oh, that's kind of a fun little thing. Now let's get on with the real meat of this segment. We're going to go talk about all of this stuff. We start climbing up the hill. We get not very far up the hill, and then here comes the rain. Here comes the rain. And it rains on us, and we are hiding out under rocks because the rain is pouring down on us. And Jack, you had to go hide under a rock with a book and read sections of a book about the fauna of the area in order to give us any kind of content whatsoever. And then when the rain stopped, we just bolted, and the whole show ended at that point. And I thought that was the funniest thing. There was no way we could do anything about that except, just hide. And so there went our plans. All this stuff, this map that you planned, that we talked about it over and over again, and then it goes down the tubes.
It was a wash.
Yeah, exactly. Literally, it was a wash, and I thought that was hilarious. So that made me laugh.
Well, going to Peavine, the origin of that name, and that book I talked about is Mentzelia, and it's about the native plants, published by the Native Plant Society of Nevada. Peavine is a very unique location because it's kind of half in the Sierra and half in the Great Basin type situation, and so it has a very unique population of wild plants. And so the peavine was a plant that the early miners had observed near the springs, and it was literally a wild pea, and so that name stuck, and the mountain became named Peavine.
The way things work. I look at this old map that you gave me, and one of the things that strikes me is Lemon's Valley.
Oh, yeah.
Which, it belonged to Lemon, according to this, instead of what now we see as Lemon Valley.
Well, that's an interesting point. In the naming process, one of the rules is you don't have a possessive, and so in time, that S was dropped for simplicity, and since the person's name was actually Lemon and not Lemons, because in this case on this map, it's the possessive S. So as a rule that has been applied over the years, that possessive S gets dropped, and so now we refer to it as Lemon Valley. And I have another example. If you're driving east on out to Lovelock and you go by, it'll say Brady's and then it'll say Hot Springs. That Brady's at one time was actually a possessive S, but in that case, they just keep the S, but there's no apostrophe. There's no possessive apostrophe.
It's the way things get named is fascinating to me. I have driven so many miles around this state, over and around peaks and valleys, and all of them named, and half of the time I think, what does that even mean? What does that name mean? Who was that person? Was that a person? Is that I think that's interesting. So I appreciate that we actually have firsthand knowledge of a peak being named, and you could explain it. You mentioned Lovelock. We just have a couple of minutes. You're spending a lot of time out there these days.
Yeah,
you did want to talk a little bit about a feature of life in Lovelock.
Yeah, I'm from Reno, but I spent a lot of time in Lovelock. I live there, and I'm a board of director on the Marsden House Museum. The Marsden House Museum is the Pershing County Museum, and I want to just excite folks about what a wonderful museum it is. We have an incredible Native American artifact display, which leads directly to the offering of visiting Lovelock Cave. The Lovelock Cave is a site on the Bureau of Land Management's property, but it is a public access type of place to recreate. You drive out there and you can hike up to Lovelock Cave, and there's an incredible history regarding Lovelock Cave. The artifacts that were found, the ancient artifacts and the archaeology of Lovelock Cave is some of the most outstanding in all of North America.
I remember it.
And our museum helps interpret that history. And so a nice jaunt out to Lovelock, go out to the Lovelock Cave, stop at the museum, see the artifact displays, get that interpretive information, and then stop in downtown Lovelock for a nice sandwich and an iced tea and ice cream, and be on your way.
This message brought to you by the Chamber of Commerce of Lovelock, Nevada. It was 23 years ago that we went to Lovelock Cave for the Wild Nevada series. I actually went and found the clip to catch up to remember when it was. It was very early.
23 years ago.
It was the 11th episode we did in the whole history of the series. So it was quite a while. It was 2001, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh yeah.
So I needed a refresher, to go back and check. And I have a feeling that it's not exactly the same as it was then.
We've made tremendous, beautiful display improvements, and so the interpretation and the ability to learn all about the history of Pershing County and Nevada. The museum contains the very extensive Native American, but also mining history and railroad history and ranching history, and it very much accompanies the history of a beautiful area of Nevada.
Nice. Well, it's time for me to get back and visit again, I think. So maybe you can take me on a tour.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And maybe we can do that.
It's time for the Wild Nevada series to get back out to Lovelock. Anyway, it's been 23 years. That's shocked me when I saw that today, and I felt a little old, to be frankly honest.
Yeah.
It was like, wow, okay. But thank you for the heads up about Lovelock. It's been a long time. I need to get back out, and I'd love to visit that museum. We did not visit the museum when we were there years and years ago, so it's time to come out, and I want to check it out. So thank you. I appreciate it.
By all means.
So, and thank you for the information. Thank you for teaching me how you name a mountain, because that was something I've always wondered about, and today I feel a little bit enlightened.
Well, you are a welcome.
Good. All right. So I want to remind everybody to watch Wild Nevada on PBS Reno via broadcast or live stream on pbsreno.org or by the YouTube channel, or, of course, on the PBS app. Now, if you're listening or watching, do you have a question about Wild Nevada, or maybe you have a comment, or maybe a suggestion? You want to tell me and tell Chris where to go, and whatever way you mean that. Send that to me at podcasts@pbsreno.org. And I would love to react and respond to some of those on future podcasts. That would be fun for me to know that people are listening and enjoying, or commenting to say, you're doing it all wrong. Whatever it is, I want to know. So Thank you, Jack Hursh. And I thank you for listening to Wild Nevadacast.